So what we want to think about is we want to think about, obviously, if we would like underdeveloped states to not be underdeveloped, if we'd like poor societies to not be sort of immersed in poverty anymore, to become developed, we have to think about, well, why are they underdeveloped in the first place? Why are developed states developed and underdeveloped states underdeveloped? What's the cause and effect? If we can figure that out, then maybe that will help us understand what we can do to improve those situations. So we're going to ask the question of what causes a state to develop or not. And I'm going to give you just a few theories. There are tons of theories out there on this, lots and lots. And even the things I'm going to talk about are going to be like entire sets of theories. I'm just going to sort of simplify it into a handful of sort of the most prominent things. So we're going to start with these things called determinism theories. I'm just going to, just a little heads up, I'm going to give you I'm just going to tell you that I am not a big fan of these determinism theories. They just don't, there's not a lot of great evidence for these. But let's just talk about what they are. It essentially says there's some structural condition. There's something that exists in this area that determines the fate of the state, whether it's developed or underdeveloped. So I'll give you, the first example is probably the easiest one. This is from a guy named Jared Diamond. He wrote this book back, 20 years ago called Guns, Germs, and Steel, which was a pretty famous book. But essentially makes this argument: if your area, your land lacks resources, there's nothing to develop, and you're probably going to be underdeveloped. So if we just take a look at this picture right here, if this is where your people are, what are your chances of really becoming a developed state? And the answer is not very much. There's not much there that you can develop. And so it probably won't. Now, okay, that's fine. And again, we look at this place up here and we say, oh, they're going to be fine. That's okay. It's not horrible. It's not perfect, though. We know a lot of places that actually, where there isn't a lot of stuff in the ground, but the state has developed pretty well, and places where there isn't, where they have. So it's not perfect. It's a good rule of thumb, but we would not say this is a very good theory. Another one, this is the theory sort of from the 1700s and 1800s and 1900s, and honestly even today, that is super creepy, and that is that race determines the level of development. And if you go back, to the Europeans back in, not too long ago, they would say, look, the Europeans are the best race. They are genetically predisposed to do super awesome things. Other races are genetically predisposed to do crappy things, and so it's not a coincidence that Europe is developed and, let's say, Africa and Asia are underdeveloped. Ugh. Awful theory. Another one would be it's still racist, don't get me wrong. This one's going to be a racist one, but just a little bit less genetic racism. And it's going to argue essentially some cultures, some practices in some cultures change things. So, for example, Latin America has a non-materialistic culture. They care much more about relationships between people than they do about stuff. And that's going to lead to a poor work ethic. Now, work ethic sort of from, again, the European standpoint. This is a very European model here. And U.S., I should add. Poor work ethic, lack of development. Now, here's the thing that we definitely know about all these things, especially these latter ones here. There's just too many exceptions to these things to make them rules. There is no, first of all, we can look here and we can say, while there are some places in the world that have particular races and lower levels of development, there's just no connection between those things. It's what we call correlation. This is from day one of the class. Correlation, not causation. There just isn't a good theory as to why these are the case. So there's just not a lot of great evidence for these deterministic theories, but you will hear these a lot if you're listening for this. And you have to be careful to avoid these things right here if that's going to be the case. All right. So I'm not starting off with a very good set here. These human beings we just can't be driven by determinism very easily. Okay, so the next one. Next set of theories is what we call mercantilism. And it's pretty simple. If I put out a map of the world and put where all the places that were colonized in the world, and then I overlaid it with a map that shows development today, it turns out those things are pretty connected. If you were a colonizer, meaning one of the states that went out in the world over the last 400 years and basically took over other parts of the world, you probably are developed today. If you were one of the colonized, you're probably underdeveloped. And we actually do see that there is, again, a strong correlation between those two things. The colonizer took resources from the colonized. I mean, it would be sort of like if I, let's say 10 years ago, no, let's say today, I show up at your house and I take all your stuff. And I make you keep giving me stuff over the next 10 years. And then one day I let you go your separate way. Well, now I've benefited from all the stuff, all my stuff, plus all the stuff I've taken from you. I've invested it. I'm doing well. Now you haven't had anything at all. You haven't invested. You haven't been able to invest in your own education or anything like that. So then who 10 years from now is going to be better off, I guess you could say, in the economic sense? And the answer is, of course, me, as opposed to you. And even 10 years after that, I just had such a head start because I took your stuff that the odds of you catching up are very, very low. And that's sort of what this argument is, that historically, the colonized just haven't been able to invest in development, where the colonizer has not only their own stuff, but they've invested these guys' stuff as well. And then we can, sort of a more modern version of this, what we call dependency theory, which is that this dynamic continues even after the colonizer doesn't have their troops there anymore. They still use their economic power, not their military power, but their economic power to dominate and continue this dynamic. Is this a valid theory? Well, two things about this. Number one, there's some validity to it. Let me just say that. The downside of it, though, is let's say that it's absolutely true. How then do you develop underdeveloped states? And the answer is, oh crap. You have to go back in a time machine and rewrite history if you really want to change this dynamic. Now, what you could do today, if you didn't have a time machine, which we don't, is you could talk about things like reparations, or you could talk about things like international aid as being a duty of the colonizing states, the former colonizing states. International aid is a duty to them, or debt relief, things like that. But man, it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one. I want you to imagine that scenario where I've been taking your stuff for the last 10 years. Okay, now how do we sort of make that right then 10 years from now? I don't really know how that's done. Which leads us to the one that is the dominant theory today in the world. This is the one that if you don't know any of those other theories, this is the one you should know, because this is the one that is practiced by the United States, practiced by Europe, practiced by the UN, by the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, banks all over. This is the one that dominates today, and it's not going to be too surprising for you. It's called neoliberalism. Don't get it too confused with our other version of liberalism. For now, just understand this theory. The type of political and economic institution a state has equals their level of development. And I'm going to give you a second just to think about what type of political institution, what type of economic institution, according to sort of this dominant view, would lead to improved level development. And the answer is free market capitalism. If you have free market capitalist economic institutions, you're going to have stronger development than otherwise. That's the theory. And then maybe democracy too, but you better have this first. This is secondary to the whole thing. So free market equals efficient economic growth. If all you care about is efficient economic growth, free market is your way to go. Now, we talked about over the course of the class that if you care about some other things, the free market might not actually provide those things. So you might have to intervene in the market and make it a little less free. But that's sort of the idea there. What this is going to do is attract more foreign direct investment. So I just want you to think about this for a second. So here's me. I'm a billionaire, okay? I got a hat, so you know I'm a billionaire. A little money sign next to me, so you know I'm living large. Okay, so where do I want to invest my billions of dollars? What country do I want to invest in? The easy answer is I want to invest in a place where I'm going to get my money back, which means I want to invest in a place where there's economic growth. So free market allows that to happen. So if the argument goes, the theory goes, if you do this, you're going to get you do free market, you're going to get efficient economic growth. And then us billionaires in the world, we're going to invest our money into your country because we want our money. That new investments is going to lead to more growth. It's going to become what we call a virtuous cycle, that it just sort of picks up speed, picks up speed, picks up speed. And the places that don't do this aren't going to get my money, so they're not going to get that more growth. The way you do this, obviously, is minimize government intervention, private property, that kind of stuff. And the big fans of this are the U.S., the EU, UN, World Bank, etc. If you name it, they're big fans of it. This is the dominant theory in the world. In fact, essentially, since the end of the Cold War, this is really the only theory in the world. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some critiques of international development. I'm going to have you watch this video. And what I want you to think about in this is free market provides efficient economic growth. What do you lose, or what could you lose, by implementing a free market? What are some of the problems that might be associated with that?